A Roman soldier's salary was once paid in the very salt you sprinkle on your food. This simple mineral built the world we know, quietly dictating the borders of empires and the fates of millions. By the end of this journey, you will see all of ancient history through the lens of this essential crystal. We will uncover how a caravan crossing a burning desert could topple a kingdom, and why a tax on this common substance could spark a revolution. What other everyday object do you think holds a secret power over our lives that soldiers' payment in salt was not a mere curiosity? It was a transaction built upon a biological imperative as old as life itself. The Latin word for this payment, salarium, is the very root of our modern term salary, a permanent echo of its immense value. But why did ancient states and armies choose this mineral as a form of money? The answer lies deep within our own bodies. Every thought that fires through your brain, every beat of your heart, depends on a delicate balance of fluids and minerals, with salt as the crucial conductor. Without it, our nerves fail to send signals, our muscles refuse to contract, and our very cells cannot function. In the ancient world, this was a matter of life and death long before it was a matter of science. A person working in the heat, like a soldier on a march or a farmer in a field, could lose this vital mineral through sweat with devastating speed. Their survival depended on replacing it. And before the invention of refrigeration, salt presented another kind of miracle. It was the only way to preserve food. A side of beef or a catch of fish would spoil in days, but salted and dried, it could feed a family through a barren winter or an army on a year-long campaign. This was not a luxury. It was the difference between sustenance and starvation, between a functioning society and collapse. That deep, primal craving for salt, written into our very biology, created an unshakable demand. It transformed this crystal from a simple seasoning into a strategic commodity more essential than gold. You cannot eat gold. You cannot power an army with it. But with salt, you could build an empire. This fundamental human need became the invisible engine of history, a force so powerful it would soon carve the first trade routes across the face of the world. Across the scorching sands of the Sahara, a line of camels moved like a slow, living river. These were the caravans, thousands of beasts and men strung out for miles, their cargo a treasure more vital than spices or silk. They carried immense slabs of salt, cut from blistering mines like Taghaza, where the sun beat down on a landscape of white crystal and dust. Their destination was the south, the legendary kingdoms of Ghana and Mali, lands flush with gold. This was the salt-gold trade, a simple, brutal exchange that became the economic heartbeat of medieval Africa. The journey itself was a trial by fire. For weeks, the caravan would traverse a sea of sand, facing temperatures that could cook a man by day and freeze him by night. Sandstorms could erase their path and bury them alive, while bands of raiders stalked the dunes, waiting to plunder a fortune in salt. The value of each slab was measured in the lives lost to bring it across the void, and it was this very danger that created immense power for those who controlled the routes. West African kingdoms like Ghana did not necessarily own the salt mines far to the north. Instead, they mastered the southern termini of the trade. They taxed every ounce of salt that entered their lands and every ounce of gold that left. This control over the flow of essential minerals built cities of astonishing wealth and defined the very borders of their empires. Their sphere of influence was not just a line on a map drawn by conquest, but a corridor of commerce, a monopoly over a life-giving substance. The silent, gleaming slabs of salt carried on the backs of groaning camels forged connections across a continent. proving that the most inhospitable barriers could be bridged by human need. Yet this system of moving mountains of salt across deserts was just one solution to a universal problem. How did other, more densely populated civilizations manage the distribution of a resource every single person required? While the Sahara caravans moved mountains of salt across vast emptiness, the Romans engineered a different kind of mastery. A steady stream of traffic flowed along the Via Salaria, the Salt Road, a stone-paved artery connecting the coastal salt pans to the bustling heart of the empire. Legionaries marched in disciplined columns, their hobnailed sandals clicking on the stone, while merchants guided carts laden with gleaming white blocks. This was not a precarious journey across a desert, but a controlled, systematic flow, a testament to Roman order. Salt was the lifeblood of the legions themselves. A marching army consumed vast quantities of preserved meat, fish, and vegetables, all rendered durable by salt. Without this logistical foundation, Rome's armies could not have campaigned for years across 3 continents. They carried the means of their own sustenance with them, a mobile food supply built entirely upon this humble mineral. To secure this vital flow, the Roman state established a monopoly. They did not leave such a critical resource to chance or the whims of the market. State-controlled saltworks produced the supply, and a complex system of distribution and taxation, managed by officials, ensured its flow. This system was so integral to the state's function that it funded everything from the construction of aqueducts and temples to the very salaries of the soldiers guarding the frontiers. This was the true meaning of the salarium, not just a payment but an entire economic engine. The Roman borders, from the walls of Britain to the deserts of Syria, were ultimately secured by salt. Its controlled distribution was a pillar of administrative power, proving that an empire's integrity could depend as much on the management of a vital resource as on the sharpness of its swords. This institutional grip, turning a biological necessity into a tool of state, would find a powerful echo thousands of miles away, in an empire built not on stone roads but on canals. Far to the east, the Chinese state perfected this art of mineral control into a system of breathtaking sophistication. While the Romans secured their roads, the Han Dynasty bureaucrats were building an administrative empire upon the salt monopoly. Picture the sprawling salt yards of coastal China, where seawater was channeled into vast, shallow pans, left to evaporate under the sun until only pure white crystals remained. This entire process, from the first scoop of brine to the final block of salt, was under the unblinking eye of the state. The government did not simply tax salt, it owned the very means of its creation. To manage distribution, they created an ingenious system of official licenses. A merchant could not simply trade in salt. They had to purchase a government-issued permit, a piece of paper that granted them the legal right to transport and sell a specific quantity. This transformed a chaotic, free-flowing trade into a regulated, predictable river of revenue flowing directly into the imperial treasury. But this was far more than a tax. It was a brilliant tool of social and political engineering. The immense wealth generated by the salt monopoly paid for the vast armies stationed along the Great Wall, the very forces that held back the nomadic steppe tribes threatening the empire's northern borders. Think about that profound connection for a moment. The salt used to flavor a bowl of rice in a southern village was directly funding the soldiers standing guard on a windswept northern wall. A common household item became the financial bedrock of national security, tying the domestic economy to the military frontier in an unbreakable loop. This system required a complex and literate bureaucracy to manage it, creating a class of administrators whose power was derived not from land or nobility, but from their control over an essential resource. The Chinese state had discovered that by gripping the supply of salt, they could hold the entire nation in their hand. Yet such absolute control over a universal necessity created a powerful temptation, a shadow economy that would challenge the empire itself. That absolute control over salt inevitably bred defiance. In the rolling hills of Renaissance Italy, the quiet grip of mineral power tightened into a fist. The year was 1540, and Pope Paul III, ruler of the Papal States, faced a costly problem. The construction of his magnificent new fortress, the Castel Sant'Angelo, required immense funds, and he saw a solution in the most reliable of commodities. He dramatically raised the tax on salt, forcing the city of Perugia, a long-time papal dominion, to buy all its salt from a single, state-controlled warehouse at an inflated price. For the proud citizens of Perugia, this was more than a financial burden. It was an intolerable assault on their autonomy. Salt was not a luxury. It was a daily necessity for preserving their meat and cheese for feeding their families. The new tax was a stark reminder that their lives were subject to the whims of a distant power. The city erupted in revolt, expelling the papal governor and tearing down the symbol of his authority, the fortress that overlooked their streets. This was the Salt War, a direct challenge to the Pope's economic and political control. The response was swift and brutal. Papal armies, funded by the very revenue streams the revolt sought to break, marched on Perugia. The city's defenses, though brave, were no match for the disciplined forces of the church. The rebellion was crushed, its leaders executed, and Perugia was forced to surrender completely. As a final, humiliating symbol of their defeat, the citizens were compelled to build a new papal fortress, a permanent monument to their failed defiance and the Pope's restored power. This short, brutal conflict was a perfect microcosm of a struggle repeated throughout history, the clash between central authority and local freedom, all fought over the right to control a simple, white crystal. It proved that when a state's grip on salt was challenged, it would not hesitate to use overwhelming force to reclaim its prize. And this pattern of conflict over essential minerals was an ancient one, echoing far beyond the battlements of Italy to the highlands of a forgotten American empire. The struggle over salt was not confined to the Old World. In the humid air of the Yucatan Peninsula, the Maya built their own civilization upon this essential crystal. Along the coast, they engineered vast networks of shallow ponds, channeling seawater and waiting for the relentless sun to evaporate the water, leaving behind a precious harvest of white salt. For the great inland cities like Tikal and Calakmul, nestled deep in the jungle, this coastal resource was a lifeline. Without it, they could not preserve their food in the tropical heat or sustain their dense populations. But salt was far more than a simple commodity to the Maya. It was a sacred substance woven into the fabric of their spiritual life. Priests used it in purification rituals, and it held a profound place in their cosmology, a gift from the gods as vital as rain or corn. This deep cultural significance amplified its economic power, making control over its sources a matter of both earthly and divine authority. A city like Salinas de los Nuevos Cerros was not just a production site, it was a strategic prize. Built around a rare inland salt spring, it became a nexus of power, its output fueling the ambitions of rival city-states. The ability to secure this resource, to control the trade routes that carried it from the coast or from such unique inland springs, directly shaped the political landscape. A city that dominated the salt trade could ensure its own people were fed and its rituals performed, while potentially withholding that same necessity from its rivals. This control over a sacred, biological imperative became a primary lever of influence, sparking competition and forging alliances. The rise and fall of Maya kingdoms can be traced not only through their stone monuments and wars, but through their silent, desperate grasp for the salt that sustained their very way of life. In the highland markets of ancient Abyssinia, a shopper would not reach for coins. Instead, they would offer a bar of rock salt, carefully shaped and standardized, known as an amul. This salt block was money. You could use it to buy grain, cloth, or livestock, its value understood by everyone in the marketplace. This was not an isolated curiosity. In the high plateaus of Tibet, cakes of salt stamped with the imperial seal circulated as currency. In the dense jungles of Borneo, salt was packed into hardened cylinders and used in trade between remote villages. Across these diverse cultures, this simple mineral transcended its role as a seasoning or preservative to become the very lifeblood of commerce. But what made salt so suitable for this role? It possessed the perfect properties of primitive money. It was durable, a crystal that would not spoil or rot over time. It was divisible. You could break a large slab into smaller, standardized pieces for smaller purchases. It was relatively scarce, requiring significant effort to produce, which prevented everyone from simply making their own and debasing its value. And most importantly, it was universally desired. Every single person, from a farmer to a king, needed salt and recognized its inherent worth. This transformation from commodity to currency was a revolutionary step. It allowed trade to flourish beyond the limitations of simple barter. A potter no longer had to find a farmer who wanted pots in exchange for wheat. They could simply sell their wares for salt, a currency everyone would accept. This facilitated the growth of more complex, interconnected economies, building markets and trade networks that stretched for hundreds of miles. The use of salt as money demonstrates its absolute integration into the economic fabric of ancient life, binding societies together with an invisible web of shared value, a value measured not in abstract symbols, but in the tangible weight of a life-giving crystal. At a medieval lord's banquet, the most powerful symbol of status was not a jeweled cup or a golden platter, but a single salt cellar placed in the center of the high table. This vessel, often ornate and precious, drew an invisible but unbreakable line through the hall. The lord, his family, and honored guests were seated above the salt. Everyone else, the knights of lower standing, commoners and servants, were seated below it. Your proximity to the salt defined your place in the world. This was not merely a seating arrangement, it was the social order made visible, a daily ritual that reinforced who mattered and who did not. The phrase above the salt entered the language as a permanent marker of privilege and high rank. But this symbolism was rooted in a harsh economic reality. Access to good salt, or any salt at all, was deeply unequal. For the wealthy, fine, white salt from distant mines was a given. For the peasant, coarse, dark salt, often mixed with ash or sand, was a costly luxury. In many feudal systems, peasants were required to pay a portion of their salt as tribute to their local lord, a direct transfer of a vital resource from the powerless to the powerful. This control over salt was a quiet, relentless engine of social stratification. The lord's ability to preserve vast quantities of meat for his table, to offer fine, salted delicacies to his guests, and to literally position the source of this life-giving mineral at his right hand, was a continuous display of his authority. The salt cellar on the table was a miniature throne, ruling over a kingdom of hunger and need. This deep divide between those who had easy access and those who struggled for it created a silent, desperate craving that would, in its most extreme form, manifest as a physical and societal sickness. The social stratification enforced by the salt cellar had a brutal, biological foundation. Without a steady supply of this mineral, the human body begins to fail. Imagine a farmer in a salt-poor region, his muscles seizing with painful cramps despite a full day of rest. His mind is clouded by a persistent fog, making simple decisions a struggle, and a deep lethargy saps his will to even rise from his bed. This is not mere fatigue, it is the body shutting down, a slow paralysis caused by the lack of a single essential ion. These debilitating symptoms would have plagued entire communities cut off from reliable sources, crippling their ability to farm, to build, or to defend themselves. This fundamental vulnerability made the location of salt a primary driver of human movement. Early populations were instinctively drawn to places where animals gathered at natural salt licks, or to coastlines where they could evaporate seawater. A valley might have the most fertile soil and plentiful fresh water, but if it held no source of salt, it could become a death trap, forcing its inhabitants into a difficult choice: stagnate and weaken, or move. This biological imperative created a quiet form of power. A tribe controlling a salt spring held immense leverage over their neighbors, who had no choice but to trade their grain, their labor, or their loyalty for access to the life-giving crystal. The very survival of a community could hinge on its relationship with a salt-rich power, creating patterns of dependency and migration that were etched not by kings or conquests, but by the silent, desperate needs of the human body. This undeniable physical reality forced every growing state to confront a critical question: how could they secure a resource that their people could not live without? The very geography of salt production became a fortress. Deep in the mountains of Austria, the village of Hallstatt was not merely a settlement, it was a guarded treasure chest. Perched on the edge of a pristine lake and surrounded by sheer slopes, its access was naturally restricted, but the inhabitants did not rely on nature alone. They built wooden walls and watchtowers that overlooked the salt mines, turning the entire production site into a defensible stronghold. This was not an isolated case. At the Wieliczka mine in Poland, the surface structures were fortified with stone walls and gates, as formidable as any royal castle. These were not just workplaces, they were critical national infrastructure, as vital to the state's survival as its treasury or its armories. The soldiers stationed here were not merely guards, they were a strategic garrison, protecting the economic heart of the kingdom from internal revolt or external raid. This defensive mindset reveals a profound truth. A state's borders were not only its outer edges, marked by rivers or mountain ranges. Its true, defensible perimeter also encircled these internal sites of mineral wealth. Troops were deployed along the salt roads and around the salt pans, blurring the line between an economic zone and a military frontier. The salt mine was a castle whose walls protected not just people, but power itself. This physical protection of the source was the most direct strategy, a clear acknowledgement that whoever controlled the salt spring controlled the lifeblood of the nation. But this brute force approach was only the beginning. The truly enduring empires learned that controlling the source was not enough. You had to control the system itself. A merchant guiding his heavy cart along the Salzstrasse, the salt road of Germany, would brace himself long before he saw the wooden barrier ahead. There, at the narrowest point of a valley or the only bridge across a river, stood the toll station, a physical manifestation of a local lord's claim. The merchant's cargo of salt, packed in sturdy barrels, was not just a commodity, it was a walking treasury, and everyone with a patch of land wanted a piece of it. He would halt his oxen, present his papers, and watch as the tollmaster calculated the fee based on the weight and value of his salt. Only after the coins changed hands would the barrier be lifted, allowing him to continue his journey, only to face the next principality's toll a few miles down the road. This was the ubiquitous reality of moving salt across Europe, a journey punctuated by a relentless series of payments. These internal tariffs, collected by counts, bishops, and free cities, were a significant source of revenue, funding everything from the local watchman's salary to the repair of the very road the merchant traveled. In this way, the salt trade directly financed local governance and infrastructure, binding the economic importance of the mineral to the daily functioning of society. Yet this system was a double-edged sword. The constant tolls could inflate the final price of salt to exorbitant levels by the time it reached a distant village, sometimes stifling the very trade that generated the wealth. The network of these toll stations formed a second, invisible border, not around a state's territory, but around the commodity itself, controlling its flow and profiting from its every mile. The sheer, reliable profitability of taxing a substance no one could live without proved an irresistible temptation, laying the groundwork for fiscal policies of such scale and oppression that they would shake empires to their core. The relentless tolls on the salt roads of Germany were a mere inconvenience compared to the systematic oppression of the French Gabelle. This salt tax was not a simple flat fee. It was a labyrinth of injustice that varied wildly from one province to the next. In some regions, known as the Pays de Grande Gabelle, every individual over the age of 8 was forced by law to buy a set amount of salt each year from the royal warehouses, at a price fixed by the king. This salt was often of poor quality and grossly overpriced, a bitter purchase the peasant had to make regardless of their need or ability to pay. Meanwhile, other provinces, the Pays de Petite Gabelle or exempt regions like Brittany, paid far less or nothing at all. This created a patchwork of resentment, where a family just on one side of an invisible administrative line could be crushed by the tax, while their neighbors a few miles away were free from its burden. The system was enforced by a hated army of tax collectors, the Gabelers, who had the power to search homes for smuggled salt and drag offenders before special courts. For the common people of France, the Gabelle was the most visceral and daily reminder of the monarchy's corruption and indifference. It was a tax on life itself, on the very substance needed to preserve their meager winter food supply. When the Estates General met in 1789, the lists of grievances carried by the Third Estate were filled with furious demands for the abolition of the salt tax. The cry against the Gabelle was not just about money, it was a cry against an entire system that controlled the most fundamental elements of survival. This state monopoly, a tool of power perfected over centuries, had been pulled so tight that it began to strangle the very state that wielded it. The revolution that toppled the French monarchy was fueled by many angers, but the bitter taste of the salt tax was on the lips of every peasant who stormed the Bastille. That same potent symbolism of salt representing freedom from oppression would echo across an ocean and into the 20th century in one of history's most powerful acts of peaceful defiance. The French Gabelle proved that a salt tax could spark a revolution, but in British India that same principle was about to topple an empire. On a warm March morning in 1930, Mahatma Gandhi stood with a small band of followers and lifted a lump of salty mud from the shores of Dandi. It was a simple, deliberate act of defiance that resonated across the subcontinent. He had just completed a 24-day march, walking 240 miles to the sea with a growing crowd of supporters. His target was the British salt monopoly, a law that made it illegal for any Indian to collect or sell salt, forcing millions to buy it from the state and pay a heavy tax. Gandhi's genius was in his choice of weapon. He did not attack a fort or a treasury. He challenged the state's authority over a natural resource as free as the air and the ocean. By openly boiling seawater to make illegal salt, he performed a powerful piece of political theater. He was demonstrating that the British claim to own the very salt on the shore was an absurd and unjust imposition. This was not a protest asking for a lower tax, it was a direct assault on the moral legitimacy of colonial rule itself. The march electrified the nation. All along the route, thousands joined him, and when he finally broke the law at Dundee, it sparked a nationwide campaign of civil disobedience. Millions of Indians followed his example, illegally making salt in a collective act of peaceful rebellion. The world's newspapers carried images of unarmed protesters being beaten by police for the crime of handling seawater, exposing the brutality required to enforce the monopoly. Gandhi had masterfully weaponized the universal human need for salt, turning a biological necessity into a symbol of freedom. This modern protest reached back into a deep, ancient well of meaning. In India, as in many cultures, salt held a sacred significance, a symbol of purity and hospitality. To break bread and salt with someone was to create a bond of trust. The British tax was not just an economic burden, it was a violation of that sacred trust. The Salt March proved that after thousands of years, the control of this simple crystal could still define the struggle between the powerful and the people, and that its symbolic weight could shake the foundations of the modern world. A Roman priest sprinkles grains of pure salt across the altar, consecrating the space for a sacred offering. In this simple act, the mineral was more than a preservative, it was a purifier, a bridge between the mortal and the divine. This reverence for salt was a universal language. In ancient Japan, Shinto priests still cast salt to cleanse a ritual space and purify sumo wrestlers before a match, banishing negative energies. The spiritual weight of salt is woven into the foundational texts of the world. The Bible refers to a covenant of salt, a binding, unbreakable agreement between God and the kings of Israel, signifying a promise meant to last forever, as enduring as the crystal itself. This was not a casual metaphor. Salt, which could preserve food from decay for years, became the perfect symbol for a pact that would never spoil or be forgotten. This profound symbolic power added an immeasurable layer to its already immense economic value. For an ancient state, controlling the supply of salt was not just a financial strategy, it was a claim to spiritual authority. When a temple required salt for its offerings, or a community needed it for a funeral rite to ensure safe passage to the afterlife, the state that provided it was not merely a tax collector, it was a patron of the divine order. This fusion of the practical and the sacred made salt an indispensable tool for legitimizing power. A king who secured the salt supply was seen not only as a shrewd administrator, but as a guardian of cosmic harmony, upholding the sacred covenants that held society together. This cultural reverence solidified into law, creating customs that persist in our language today. We still speak of someone being worth their salt, a phrase that echoes a time when this mineral was the measure of a person's value, their loyalty, and their sacred bond. The solemn sharing of salt between kings was a bond stronger than any parchment. Across the ancient Near East, from the empires of Mesopotamia to the kingdoms of the Levant, the most crucial diplomatic treaties were sealed not just with a handshake, but with a shared meal where salt was prominently featured. This was the covenant of salt, a ritual that transformed a meal into a sacred, unbreakable pact. To eat the salt of another ruler was to accept a profound obligation of loyalty and mutual protection. The salt itself, a preservative that defied decay, symbolized that the agreement would remain pure and effective for all time. To violate such a covenant was considered a betrayal of the deepest order, an offense against both the host and the divine order that witnessed the meal. This practice elevated salt from a simple commodity into a primary instrument of statecraft. A powerful king could secure the loyalty of a weaker neighbor by offering the symbolic protection of his salt, thereby drawing that kingdom into his sphere of influence without a single arrow being loosed. These formal alliances, forged in the quiet ceremony of a diplomatic dinner, were ultimately built upon the bustling, informal economy that salt created every single day. The same caravans that supplied the royal kitchens with fine salt also filled the market stalls, enabling the common transactions that kept ancient societies functioning. The king's political power and the merchant's livelihood were two sides of the very same coin, a crystal that governed everything from international peace to the price of bread. The true power of salt extended far beyond the dinner table or the tax collector's ledger. It acted as a silent economic engine, a multiplier that unlocked entire industries which would have otherwise been impossible. Think of the great cod fisheries of the North Atlantic. For centuries, ships from Portugal, Spain, and England sailed to the teeming waters off Newfoundland, their holds filled not with fish, but with salt from the sunny Mediterranean. The catch was so immense it could never be consumed fresh, but by salting and drying the cod right on the ships, they transformed a perishable resource into a durable, transportable commodity. This created a vast, interlocking economy. The salt producers of southern Europe funded the shipbuilders of the north, who employed the fishermen, who fed the populations of growing cities across the continent. Salt was the indispensable link in this chain, turning a local harvest into a global trade. The same principle applied on land. Without salt, a farmer's surplus pig was just a temporary bounty, but salted and cured, it became ham and bacon, valuable goods that could be stored or sold for months. The dairy farmer could transform milk into hard, long-lasting cheeses. The tanner relied on vast quantities of salt to cure hides and prevent them from rotting before they could be turned into leather for shoes, saddles, and armor. Even early metallurgists used salt in processes to harden certain metals. Each of these vital secondary industries was built upon a foundation of reliable salt. This created a radiating web of economic interdependence, where the prosperity of a fisherman in Norway, a cheesemaker in Switzerland, and a tanner in England were all silently tied to the output of a salt pan in Sicily or a mine in Poland. The entire structure of the medieval economy became delicately balanced upon the steady, uninterrupted flow of this one mineral. Yet this complex web was also incredibly fragile, vulnerable to the smallest disruption. A merchant galley heavy with Cypriot salt ran under a hard wind, its crew scanning the horizon not for land, but for the telltale silhouette of a pirate sail. On the shifting dunes of the Sahara, a Tuareg raider watched a salt caravan from a high ridge, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. For as long as salt moved, violence followed close behind. This was the great paradox of the trade. The substance that built civilizations also attracted their predators. Salt was the perfect target, a cargo both immensely valuable and frustratingly bulky. A pirate could not easily conceal a shipload of gold, but a captured salt vessel could be diverted to any one of 100 coves, and its contents sold off piece by piece with no questions asked. Its very nature as a universal necessity guaranteed a ready market for stolen goods. This constant threat forced merchants and empires into a costly dance of protection. Salt ships in the Mediterranean often traveled in armed convoys, their decks patrolled by mercenaries. Caravans crossing the Sahara hired local tribes as guides and guards, paying a premium for safe passage through territories where the line between protector and predator was notoriously thin. In later centuries, this risk would be formalized through marine insurance, where a London underwriter could calculate the premium for a salt shipment based on the season, the route, and the rumored whereabouts of Barbary corsairs. For states, the problem was even greater. They had to fortify not just the mines but the entire route, maintaining garrisons at key ports and oases to secure the flow of revenue. The persistent drain of banditry and piracy was a direct tax on the trade, a hidden cost that was ultimately paid by every consumer in the form of higher prices. This omnipresent danger inevitably warped the economic landscape. A town located just 100 miles from a salt source, but separated by bandit-infested hills, might pay 10 times more for its salt than a city 500 miles away connected by a secure, patrolled Roman road. The real value of salt was not just measured in its weight, but in the safety of the journey it had to endure. The flavor of an entire civilization could be defined by the chemistry of its local salt pans. In ancient Rome, the salt harvested from the coastal flats at Ostia carried with it a subtle hint of the Mediterranean, a faint taste of the sea that infused the garum, the olives, and the bread of the Roman diet. This was not a generic seasoning, it was a distinct regional ingredient, as characteristic of Roman cuisine as a specific grape is to a wine from a particular valley. This concept of terroir, the idea that a place imparts a unique character to what it produces, applies just as powerfully to salt as it does to wine. The mineral content of the spring, the algae in the seawater, even the type of wood used to evaporate the brine, all left an indelible mark on the final crystal. A state that controlled a unique salt source, like the pink salt from the Himalayas or the black lava salt from Hawaii, did not just control a commodity, it controlled a brand. They could cultivate a reputation for their specific product, creating a specialized demand that reached far beyond their borders. This allowed for a sophisticated form of economic power. A kingdom might not produce the most salt, but if its salt was considered the finest, the most flavorful, or the most pure, it could command a premium price and secure a privileged niche in the sprawling trade networks. This gave rise to localized monopolies of taste. A French chef in the 17th century might insist on salt from the marshes of Guiarand for his finest dishes, while a merchant in Timbuktu would pay a fortune for the dense, flavorful slabs from the desert mine of Taoudeni. This intricate geography of taste added a new layer of complexity to the ancient salt trade. It was no longer just about moving a generic white crystal from a place of plenty to a place of need. It was about curating desire, about creating and supplying a market for specific sensory experiences. Managing this intricate web of regional specialties and their perceived value required more than just ledgers and scales. It demanded a universal language of measurement and worth that could bridge cultures and continents. The Venetian merchant's ledger was a dense forest of numbers and notations, each line a story of risk and calculation. He did not simply record barrels of salt, but meticulously detailed their origin, the coarseness of the grain, the moisture content, and the specific shipping route assigned to each lot. A shipment of fine salt from Cyprus destined for the fish curers of Constantinople was logged with a different value than coarse bay salt from Ibiza, meant for preserving hides in Flanders. This was not mere bookkeeping, it was a sophisticated language of commerce, born from the necessity of moving immense value across unpredictable seas. To manage such complexity, merchants and port authorities developed universal standards. The Venetian stotto became a widely recognized measure for salt, a fixed volume that allowed a merchant in Alexandria to agree on a price with a buyer in London, even though they would never meet. Contracts evolved beyond simple handshake deals, specifying delivery dates, penalties for water damage, and even insurance against piracy. This demand for secure, long-distance trade fueled the earliest forms of international banking. A merchant could deposit gold with a banking family in Venice and receive a letter of credit to be exchanged for local currency in Cairo, allowing him to purchase salt without the peril of transporting chests of coin. The very mechanics of the salt trade required and refined these financial instruments. The relentless need to calculate profits, losses, exchange rates, and transport costs pushed the boundaries of mathematics, encouraging the adoption of Arabic numerals and double-entry bookkeeping over clumsy Roman numerals. This was the quiet, practical birthplace of modern accounting, all driven by the need to track the flow of a white crystal. The logistical challenge of coordinating the loading of 100 ships, the warehousing of thousands of tons of cargo, and the payment of countless sailors and carters demanded a new kind of organization. It required scribes, auditors, and managers, a professional bureaucracy whose sole purpose was to oversee this river of mineral wealth. This administrative class, first cultivated to manage the salt monopoly, became the backbone of the early modern state, their skills easily transferred to taxing other goods and managing public works. The sheer economic power concentrated in this trade could not escape the notice of philosophers. As early as the 16th century, thinkers were observing how the price of salt in a given city could influence the price of fish, leather, and even labor. They saw that a tax on salt did not just raise revenue, it rippled through every facet of the economy, affecting what people could afford to eat and wear. These observations were the first tentative steps toward economic theory, an attempt to understand the invisible forces set in motion by humanity's oldest and most essential commodity. Pliny the Elder, that relentless Roman chronicler of the natural world, looked upon the salt pans of his empire and declared that nothing was more essential than salt and sunshine. In his vast encyclopedia, he recorded its prices, its production methods, and its profound role in Roman life, capturing the sheer economic weight of this humble crystal. Half a world away, Chinese state philosophers were engaged in a far more complex debate, one that would shape empires for 2,000 years. In the court of the Han Dynasty, the legalist thinkers who championed the salt monopoly argued with brutal pragmatism. They believed that by controlling this vital resource, the state could drain wealth from powerful merchant clans and fill the public treasury without directly taxing the struggling peasantry. It was a tool of centralization and social control. Yet this pragmatic control raised a deep and troubling ethical question, one that philosophers in many cultures quietly pondered. What was the moral price of putting a tax on life itself? When a state transforms a universal human necessity into a source of revenue, it creates a fundamental tension between the power of the sovereign and the survival of the subject. The Roman statesman Cassiodorus captured this paradox perfectly, writing that men could live without gold but never without salt. This was the core of the ancient dilemma. How could a government ethically manage a resource that every single person, from the highest senator to the lowest slave, required simply to exist? These were not abstract academic exercises. The policies born from these early debates determined whether a frontier soldier got his pay, whether a city could withstand a siege, and whether a peasant family could afford to preserve their food for the winter. The theories developed in antiquity, balancing state necessity against human need, created a political and economic template that would be adopted, adapted, and fought over for centuries. The quiet grip of salt on ancient states was not merely a matter of logistics or finance. It was one of humanity's first and most enduring experiments in resource economics, an experiment whose consequences we are still navigating today. That same relentless demand for salt left a permanent scar upon the landscape. To fuel the boiling houses of inland saltworks, entire forests fell. Imagine the constant, hungry fires needed to evaporate thousands of gallons of brine into a precious residue of crystals. In regions from ancient China to Celtic Europe, woodcutters worked in shifts, clearing vast tracts of woodland to feed the kilns. This was not a small-scale operation. It was an industrial appetite that could denude a mountain in a generation. altering local climates and contributing to soil erosion that would choke rivers with silt for centuries to come. Along coastlines, the transformation was just as profound. Engineers did not simply find natural pans, they created them, reshaping miles of shoreline into a geometric maze of shallow ponds, gates, and channels. These solar evaporation works, while less destructive than boiling, still represented a massive human intervention, redirecting seawater and fundamentally changing the ecology of the intertidal zone. The Roman salt pans at the mouth of the Tiber River are a prime example. The extensive diking and channeling for salt production likely altered the flow of sediment, accelerating the siltation of the river delta itself. Over time, the very coastline that housed this vital industry was transformed by its needs, a slow-motion geological change driven by economic imperative. This environmental footprint is the often invisible cost of ancient power. The quiet grip of salt extended its fingers into the soil and the water, leaving a legacy written not in ledgers, but in the pollen records of vanished forests and the layered silt of ancient estuaries. Yet this relentless consumption also sparked remarkable ingenuity, pushing engineers to develop ever more efficient ways to wrest the crystal from the earth and the sea. The ingenuity of salt production is a story written in sunlight, water, and fire. The most ancient method, solar evaporation, required nothing more than shallow ponds and the patient heat of the sun. The Romans perfected this along their coasts, just as the Chinese did on theirs, creating vast, shimmering landscapes where seawater slowly surrendered its white treasure. But what if the salt was not in the sea, but locked deep within the earth? In the salt beds of ancient Sichuan, Chinese engineers performed a kind of geological alchemy known as solution mining. They drilled boreholes deep into the underground salt deposits, then flushed water down to dissolve the mineral and bring the resulting brine back to the surface. This was not a simple collection, it was an active extraction, a sophisticated process that tapped into resources invisible from the surface. In the cooler, cloudier climates of Europe, where the sun was a less reliable partner, innovation took a different form. The development of lead pans for boiling brine was a revolutionary leap. These large, metal pans could be heated over constant fires, rapidly evaporating the water from brine pumped from inland springs or mines. This technology freed production from the tyranny of climate, allowing for a massive increase in output and turning regions like Cheshire in England into salt-producing powerhouses. Each of these methods, from the passive solar ponds to the aggressive solution mines and the industrial boiling houses, was a direct response to local geography. The universal human need for this crystal forced the invention of tailored technologies to meet it. This relentless drive for greater efficiency and volume was a quiet, consistent engine of progress, pushing the boundaries of engineering, chemistry, and logistics. For millennia, this mineral's quiet grip on power was absolute, a force that built roads and funded armies. But as we move into our own era of refrigeration and global trade, we must wonder if its ancient reign has finally come to an end. Walk down any supermarket aisle today and you will find salt in absurd abundance, stacked in neat cylinders sold for pennies. It is a ghost of the treasure that once built empires. This dramatic shift from priceless mineral to cheap commodity marks the end of its ancient reign, a revolution driven by three powerful forces. First, the discovery of immense underground deposits, like the vast salt beds beneath Detroit and the colossal mine at Godrich in Ontario, revealed that the earth held near limitless reserves. We no longer had to rely on the slow evaporation of seawater or a few precious springs. Second, industrial-scale mining and drilling technology allowed us to harvest this buried wealth with staggering efficiency. Giant machines could chew through salt layers, producing in a single day what might have taken a medieval mine a year to yield. But the true death knell for salt's strategic power was the invention of refrigeration. For millennia, salt was the only reliable way to preserve food. A society's survival through winter, an army's ability to campaign, all hinged on this one mineral's preservative magic. The icebox and later the electric refrigerator shattered that monopoly overnight. Food could now be kept fresh without being packed in salt, severing the most critical link between the crystal and human survival. With its role in preservation broken and its supply rendered virtually infinite, salt's geopolitical value collapsed. The strategic importance of the Via Salaria or the Saharan caravan routes faded into history. Control over this essential resource shifted from kings and emperors to the anonymous forces of global commodity markets. The quiet grip that had dictated borders and funded wars for thousands of years was finally pried open by the wrench of industry. Yet if you know where to look, the ghost of that power still lingers, etched into the names on our maps and the very roads we travel. The ghost of the Via Salaria still lives beneath the asphalt of modern highways. If you trace the path of a major European motorway or a crucial North American trade corridor, you will often find it overlaid on a Roman road, a medieval cart track, or a prehistoric trail, all of which were originally beaten flat by the footsteps of merchants and the wheels of salt carts. The most efficient routes for moving goods were established millennia ago by the flow of essential commodities, and our modern infrastructure is frequently just a high-speed echo of that ancient logic. This is not a coincidence, it is a geographical inheritance. The path of least resistance for a truck carrying microchips is often the same one that was first carved out for a wagon carrying slabs of salt. The very bones of our global trade network were shaped by the demands of this humble mineral. This ancient influence is even more starkly visible in the political map of the world. Look at the long, straight, and seemingly arbitrary borders that slice across the Sahara Desert. These lines, drawn by colonial powers in European capitals, often cut directly across traditional tribal territories and ancient caravan routes. Yet, in their placement, they frequently acknowledge old spheres of influence, the very zones controlled by kingdoms like Ghana and Mali, who grew wealthy by taxing the salt and gold trade. The modern border between Algeria and Mali, for instance, still reflects a centuries-old struggle to control the flow of wealth across the dunes. The invisible hand of the salt trade, which first sketched these corridors of power, left a faint but permanent line on the parchment of history, one that modern diplomats simply traced over in ink. The fundamental principle at work here has not changed, only the resources have. The ancient state's monopoly on salt is the direct ancestor of a modern nation's control over its oil fields or natural gas reserves. Just as the Han Dynasty bureaucrats used salt revenue to fund the Great Wall, a modern petrostate uses its oil wealth to build its military and secure its borders. The same strategic calculus applies. Control a resource that the world cannot do without, and you command immense geopolitical power. The patterns of dependency, the risk of smuggling, and the potential for conflict are all hauntingly familiar. We have simply swapped a white crystal for black gold. Recognizing this deep continuity is more than an academic exercise. It is a key to understanding the hidden architecture of our world. The forces that carved the first trade routes and funded the first empires are the same ones shaping our headlines today. By learning to see the salt roads of antiquity in the fiber optic cables and oil pipelines of the modern era, we gain a profound new lens on history. It reveals that the struggle for essential resources is a constant, a powerful current running beneath the surface of human civilization. dictating the rise and fall of powers in a rhythm as old as the first caravan that ever crossed a desert. The grand narrative of history has always been told through the lives of kings and the thunder of battles, but this is a story with a crucial missing character. For every epic conquest, there was a supply line of salt that made it possible. For every flourishing city, there was a nearby salt spring or a secure trade route that provided its lifeblood. The true map of the ancient world was not just a patchwork of empires, but a web of salt roads, a geography dictated by the silent, non-negotiable demands of the human body. We must learn to see this hidden layer. When you look at the ruins of a great capital, ask not only who ruled there, but where their salt came from. The answer will often reveal the true source of their power and the hidden vulnerability that ultimately led to their decline. This perspective does not diminish the role of great leaders or dramatic events. Instead, it enriches our understanding, grounding the dizzying heights of political history in the solid earth of economic and biological reality. The next time you pass a grain of salt between your fingers, remember that you are holding a piece of the past. It is a crystal that built roads, funded revolutions, and drew the invisible borders of forgotten kingdoms. Its story is a reminder that the most profound forces shaping our world are often the quietest ones, the fundamental needs that connect every human life across the centuries. These invisible threads of salt wove through the very fabric of ancient civilization, creating a pattern of power we have only just begun to see. From the sun-scorched caravans of the Sahara to the meticulous monopolies of Han China and the crushing weight of the French Gabelle, this simple crystal was never just a seasoning. It was money in the marketplace, a cause for war, and a sacred symbol on the altar. Its quiet grip dictated the paths of trade, determined the location of fortresses, and drew the lines between social classes, proving that the most profound forces in history are often the ones we overlook in our own kitchens. The empires you read about in history books rose and fell by its power, their foundations cemented not only in stone but in salt. The next time your fingers pass over a salt shaker, pause for a moment. You are holding a relic of forgotten kingdoms, a crystal that once funded armies and built roads. If this journey through the hidden corridors of history has intrigued you, we invite you to delve deeper by subscribing for more content. Let us know in the comments which ancient mystery we should explore together next.